M&As. We have actually got 15,000 people here. We've committed well over £2 billion of capital. It's our biggest business in Asia. It represents about 20% of our Asian revenues, and we are present across the full gamut of activities ranging from corporate banking to investment banking, mergers and acquisitions, risk management, equities, and debt. And it's been a very good experience for us. I guess we're an example of a business that's grown organically over time, and we've localized our management, and that has really been the key to a successful operation in India. But my aim today is to talk to you quickly about some of the trends in mergers and acquisitions in India, particularly in cross-border mergers and acquisitions, because there's been a very significant change between the initial period of the mid to late 2000s, when we saw a bunch of Indian entrepreneurs with large businesses making enormous acquisitions abroad for different reasons. And today, when those large transactions are no longer happening, and in fact the trend has reversed, and we're seeing India becoming a much more attractive place for foreign businesses to acquire. That, in a sense, is the central trend that I'm going to talk about in the next few slides. So if you look at a sort of summary of M&A activity over the past 10 years, before I get onto this slide, the main thing to talk about in the late 2000s was the emergence of an outbound trend in M&A. As I said, there were 3 or 4 key drivers for this outbound M&A, one of which was the search for new markets. A classic example of this was Bharti, a big telecom company, their acquisition of Zain in Africa, which gave them an operation of 15 countries in Africa for $10 billion in 2010. Another driver for M&A in the late 2000s was search for new technologies. A good example of that is Mahindra's acquisition of the Korean business Sanyong, which in 2008, which gave it a sports utility vehicle technological capability so it could produce its own SUVs. And a third very important trend in Indian outbound M&A has been energy security. Throughout the period since the mid-2000s, Indian businesses, particularly state-owned businesses like the oil company OVL, or like some infrastructure groups like Adani, have been acquiring selective oil and gas assets in Africa, in Russia, coal assets in places like Australia, to generally ensure India's energy security. And I would say these were the 3 principal buckets of M&A in which large Indian businesses operated in the sort of mid to late 2000s. Now, what happens over the period since then, as is shown by this slide, is that over the period from 2010 to 2015, 50% of the total M&A has been domestic and 50% has been international. But the proportion of, within the international 50%, the proportion that's represented by outbound M&A has been falling year by year, while the proportion represented by inbound M&A has been rising year by year. And a good question to examine is why this was the case. So first of all, the rise of inbound M&A. What we've seen over the past 5 years is basically India becoming a much more attractive investment destination and being seen to be more attractive relative to other emerging markets. Other emerging markets like Brazil, Russia, China clearly have their own problems at the moment, but India is seen as a strong domestic market. Growth has held up, and it's therefore relatively more and more attractive to international acquirers. Good government policies under Modi, and stability in the current China-induced tremors around emerging markets are only going to make India more attractive in the future as an investment destination. And we've seen a number of multinationals over the past few years, ranging from Unilever to GSK to Vodafone, among just British internationals, raising their stakes in their Indian subsidiaries in very substantial transactions, showing their willingness to bet on India as a long-term investment destination. A second very important factor in the rise of inbound M&A has been the rise of a private equity culture. Private equity managers have gone in, educated promoters, and persuaded them to sell their businesses rather than to hand them on to the next generation. And whereas the Indian culture was very opposed to selling their own businesses in terms of promoters during the late 2000s, since 2010, the culture has become much more open to promoters selling their businesses. And it's really the advent of big private equity companies like Blackstone, like TPG, like KKR, like Warburg Pincus, who've achieved that. And you're seeing many more promoters being prepared to sell their businesses rather than to pass them on to their children as they used to in the past. Coupled with that, moderating value expectations, it used to be the case that Indian promoters wanted sky-high valuations for their businesses. That is becoming less and less so. And high global liquidity, we're in a period when there's a huge volume of M&A globally. Companies are well capitalized, and they've got funding available to put deals to work in India. In terms of sectors, digital, with the explosion of e-commerce in India, healthcare with a very strong domestic healthcare base of good generic companies, industrials and defense within the industrial space, insurance where the government is opening up insurance. All of these are sectors which have been the subject to domestic M&A. And I've listed a few of the deals below that have taken place. A good example, which we worked on a couple of years ago, was a French dairy producer called Lactalis that acquired a family-controlled South India-based milk products business called Tirumala Milk Products for about $300 million. It was owned by private equity. They persuaded the owners to sell the business, and this French multinational came in, and there were three brothers in the business. They bought the business out. Coupled with the rise of inbound M&A has been the decline that I talked about of outbound M&A. And the reason here is that a number of the very large transactions that happened in the mid to late 2000s have either not worked or have not worked out as well as was expected, or are taking time to work out. And for corporate India, it's really been a period of learning how to do M&A, because before the mid-2000s, there was very little cross-border M&A. So for every JLR, which is regarded as a huge success, with Tata's acquiring JLR, and JLR really, as everyone knows, having exploded its sales across China and the world. And in fact, to some extent, JLR is really supporting its parent, Tata Motors now. So that's seen as a very successful M&A outbound transaction. But some other transactions have been less successful. Bharti's acquisition in Africa has still to be seen as a success. I think the challenges of integrating 15 countries across Africa have proved more than the management of Bharti probably expected. And so what we've seen is this year, in another transaction, Bharti actually selling 4 of those countries off in a transaction that's still taking place to try and rationalize those operations and bring them under control. So it just shows that M&A takes a long time to execute. There are significant challenges involved, and it can take years to see whether a deal is successful or not. And I think generally the experience of these very large transactions in the mid-2000s has been that some of them have been very challenging. Another one is Tata's acquisition of Chorus, the steel operations of Chorus in the UK for $12 billion. Significant challenges there of all sorts, particularly around the ability of Chorus to source cheap feedstocks. As time has moved on, and we're now 10 years after some of these deals, the managers of India's large conglomerates realize the challenges that these large deals do. And I think we're going to see for the future smaller transactions, much more sort of focused and carefully thought out. Looking forward, key sectors in which M&A will take place outbound are healthcare. There's a very strong tier of domestic, generic Indian pharma companies that are multinational in nature and expanding abroad and have a cadre of professional managers with well-thought-out strategies. We've seen some transactions already this year, one by a company called Lupin that bought a company in the US called Gavis, a second by a company called Cipla, who bought a company called Invagen only 2 weeks ago. And the next speaker, Sudhanshu, the COO of Cipla, is going to give a case study of that transaction. So healthcare is a sector where India is very strong. And I think, as Sudhanshu will tell you, with competent professional managers in the key healthcare companies, a much more focused approach to M&A is possible. And oil and gas is another sector where it's a natural for Indian companies to acquire abroad because of the energy security issues that India faces and the ability of OVL, the state oil company, to acquire assets in Africa and in Russia to make up that energy security, or insecurity rather. So looking forward, we think that the factors promoting outbound M&A in the future will remain search for new markets, new technology, energy security, and also Africa, which is a very important geography next to India, where India knows how to play. It's the near abroad for India, and lots of Indian multinationals are present there. We think the experience of the last 10 years with some of the first large outbound transactions facing problems will make Indian businesses be much more selective about their outbound acquisitions. In many cases, they've brought in professional cadres of managers with experience of M&A, cross-border M&A, and Sudhanshu, who's coming up next, is one of those managers. They've professionalized their boards, and promoters are less likely to take decisions on their own. And so I think we will see continued outbound M&A, but at a smaller scale in terms of size, and being much more selective in terms of the goals. India, UK, by the way, a very quick word. It's a key cross-border partnership, as everybody knows, and there's been substantial M&A both ways between India and the UK. In fact, the UK is the top investor in India through M&A since 2010, with $33 billion of transactions. And I've listed below a couple of the very large transactions that have been done. BP acquiring a stake in Reliance is one. Diageo acquiring United Spirits is another. And finally, these are some of the M&A deals that we've been involved in. And just over the course of the 10-year period that I've been discussing, it's noticeable that whereas in about 2005 to 2007, we'd be doing 2 sales for every purchase that we worked on. It's now, 2 purchases for every sales that we worked on. It's now the other way around. We do 2 sales for every purchase. So there's been a complete shift in the cross-border dynamics with much more activity into India than out of India. Thank you very much.